My name's Alison and I'm the director of Closer. And what we thought would be really helpful is just, I'm going to start off by just saying a very brief introduction to Closer and what it is we do. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the value of discovery and what we hope the studies already in the system will be getting out of it and what other studies might also get from it. So Closer is an ESRC and MRC funded initiative. Our mission is very grand, and it's to maximise the value, the use and the impact of the many fine longitudinal studies that we have within the UK and to increase our outreach internationally as well. At the moment, we work with 8 studies. There are 8 studies that are part of the Closer consortium, all shown here on this graphic. The sort of colour indicates the age of the participants within the studies. So just to, without going into a huge amount of detail, but just to say a little bit about the types of studies, you've got the big UK national birth cohort. So you've got the MRC National Survey of Health and Development, that's the 1946 cohort. You've got the 58 NCDS, Child Development Survey, the 1970 British cohort study, and then finally the Millennium cohort study, which is the most recent of the big national birth cohorts. You've also got 3 regional studies, so they focus on specific areas. At the top, the Hertfordshire cohort study, which follows up a group of people who were born in the 1930s in Hertfordshire. You've got the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, which is based in the Bristol area and is a sample of people born in the early 1990s. And then the final sort of regional study is the Southampton Women's Survey, which is a sample of mothers and their children born in the Southampton area. And then last, but by no means least, Understanding Society is the only non-cohort study, so it's a household panel survey that's representative of the UK population as a whole, and we're going to be hearing later on about the experiences of Understanding Society in terms of their adding their metadata to discovery. And we have 2 other partners, the UK Data Service and the British Library. So my final slide on what Closer is. This just really tries to set out our key activities. So we have a set of scientific projects that very much focus on using the data that already exists, that has been collected by these 8 studies, and trying to encourage more harmonisation. And by that I mean looking at the variables and the questions that have been collected over the years and thinking about how they could be compared from one study to another. So we have a whole series of projects that are focused on harmonising key measures in order to enable cross-study comparisons, because only by doing that do you really get a sense of the direction of travel on a number of issues. So just to give you an example, there was a very nice work package that harmonised measures of obesity using height and weight data from across the cohort studies, and that was then able to plot the kind of rise of the obesity epidemic and look at how different social groups were faring in that experience. We have a range of data linkage projects that basically are focused on facilitating linking administrative records to survey data. Some of you might be aware that that's a very desirable thing to do, but quite a difficult thing to do. And so we have a number of projects that have been trying to kind of battle on to do more work in that area. We then have a team who are very much concerned with trying to promote the value of longitudinal research. So that might simply mean taking some of the results of the harmonisation or the data linkage work and trying to promote that more widely. Or it might mean public affairs activity that's specifically focused on trying to raise the profile of longitudinal studies within government or within Parliament. And then last, and why we're here, is we also have a very large strand of work that's focused on discoverability. So it's focused on trying to make it easier for people to find out what questions have been asked across the studies. And making it easier for them to explore dataset content before they start their analysis. And that's what discovery is all about. So we're going to hear a lot more about this from Will, who's speaking next. But just by way of introduction, for those of you who aren't aware, Closer Discovery is a search platform that enables users to identify content from across the 8 existing Closer studies. Users can do that in a number of ways. They can search for questions. So they can search for the specific questions that people were asked as part of the study. They can search for different topics and see what questions have been asked that correspond to those topics. Or they can search for variables. And by variables, I mean the actual items within the data sets that they will later request or download. Crucially, and as we'll see later on, they can explore the context within which a question was asked. So they can look at a question and they can see where it appeared in the questionnaire, which questions preceded it, which questions came after it. And that can be very useful, firstly in understanding a little bit more about the question and the responses, but also at seeing what other questions have been asked on that topic in that same instrument. Crucially, you can easily save and then export any questions, variables that you find that you think might be of interest, and I'm sure Will is going to touch on that in his talk as well. And then you can find out how to access the data. And the key point in relation to access is really that roughly half the closer studies deposit their data sets with the UK Data Service, and so potential users can sign an end user license and then request the full data set from the UK Data Service. So those tend to be the predominantly ESRC, social science studies. The other half of the closer studies have their own access requirements. Typically, users will need to approach the study directly and request specific bundles of variables. They won't be requesting the whole data set. And we might come back to that later on as an example of an area where we're hoping to do some more work in the future. Any questions, more general questions before I move on? Okay. So what I wanted just to sort of finish on really is by talking through three key things that we really hope studies would get out of joining Discovery. So the first of these is really about transparency. And the key point here is that within Discovery, you've got a huge amount of information, linked information, about the study content that's available to potential users. So for example, and this is the one that to me as a researcher is particularly exciting, is that it will show you for an item in a data set how that has been derived from the questions within the questionnaire. Now that might be relatively straightforward for modern studies that are well documented, but actually for some of the older studies and the older rounds of the older studies, that can be really difficult to establish. So that's a real key advantage that I think you get out of Discovery that's quite hard to get out of any other system. Another very exciting attribute of Discovery is that it allows you to see how many people have answered a particular answer option. And again, as a researcher, that's something that's incredibly useful for various data sets, because what it allows you to do is when you're scoping out what questions might help you answer your research topics, you can look at the questions and then you can see how many people are in particular categories of interest to you. And again, that's a really useful tool to have before you actually start going through the process of trying to get access to the data. It's very frustrating to get the data and then discover only 5 people answered the question that's actually relevant to you. And you can get around this using Discovery. And then finally, another sort of good example of the advantage of transparency is that it gives you a really clear illustration of the question routing. So how many people got asked that question, and how was the decision about who got asked a particular question reached? What were the sort of prior conditions? So that's one key advantage of Discovery. It's very transparent. It brings together information that I'm sure most studies have, but it brings it together into one integrated system. A second advantage is that it's a very efficient approach to managing your content, your metadata. It brings together content from long-running studies into a digitized and integrated format. And again, thinking about some of the older studies within Discovery who've been collecting data for decades, that has been a very useful process. They've now got all of their content in one format that they can easily interrogate and add to, rather than being spread across a whole range of different systems in different formats. And one key advantage of that is that we do it once, okay? You go through that process of creating metadata for your study, which can be a laborious process, as we will hear later on. But once that's done, you then have something you can share very easily. So there are various tools that you can use, APIs, that you could then use to share the metadata for your study to another search platform that also wants to use metadata. You don't have to then do that again. And then finally, and a key motivation for Closer in creating and promoting discovery is about the fact that it helps you promote data use. It provides users with a very easy tool that allows them to interrogate a very large amount of information about your study. And by doing that, we strongly hope and suspect that that will help improve the use of study data. In addition, it really helps to facilitate cross-study comparisons, which is one of the areas that Close is really interested in, because it will allow people easily to find out about similar questions that have been asked on different studies, which will help them then think about how you could use longitudinal studies to answer those cross-cutting questions. And then the final point I wanted to make is that our current funding ends in September, but we're in very final stages of agreeing a 2-year extension with our funders, the ESRC and MRC. And as part of that extension, we have very ambitious plans about trying to improve some of the functionality and add to the functionality. So just a couple of examples of things that we're particularly keen to do in that period are one of the great things about discovery that Will show you later on is that you can use it to create lists. So if you're interested in looking at questions on mental health across particular cohorts, you can create for yourself a basket of items that tap mental health issues. At the moment, that's only available to you. It's a private list, if you like. But we're really keen to add some functionality that will allow people to share their lists and include them on the website. So for example, we're very conscious that there are some items that are very laborious and time-consuming to search for. So we've been in discussions with a researcher who's interested in looking at what questions have been asked over the years on non-residents about non-resident parents. Now, that's a quite hard thing to search for. If you try and think about what would your search terms be to search for that, it's quite difficult. Obviously, it's quite a niche area, but there are people who are really, really interested in finding those questions. She can do the work, and she can then publish that list so that other researchers can then benefit from that. And that's a key bit of functionality we want to add. Another thing that we want to do in our 2-year extension is, at the moment, if you find a series of items for, say, ALSPAC or one of the cohort studies, the Millennium Cohort Study, you will be directed to the data for that study. So in the case of the Millennium Cohort Study, you'd be directed to the UK Data Service. In the case of ALSPAC, you'd be directed to their data access system. We want to do some more work on trying to explore how you could link data discovery to data access in an easier way, and try and make that a more streamlined process, because obviously from the point of view of users, they want a clear way of finding what questions are there and then being able to go to ask for that data. And we're fairly confident that Closer Discovery can help them do that.